Okay. Good morning, almost actually good afternoon, everybody. This is session 3 of our wonderful Heads Up for Head Teachers Summer Fete. Really excited about this session. So far this morning, if you've been with us all morning, just a quick recap. We've looked at celebrating the role of headship and the work that Heads Up for Head Teachers community does in celebrating the role of headship. In our last session, we talked about the importance of purpose and reconnecting to purpose as leaders, not just because of the pandemic, pre-pandemic, and making sure that we've got that really strong connection to what we do in our communities as school leaders. And out of that work that we did across the network, for what we realized very early on were sort of groups of hundreds of sort of really values aligned leaders. We recognized that actually those values aligned leaders wanted to talk about what education could be and perhaps what it should be and where it could evolve to and what it could become in the future. And so last October, supported by the wonderful Big Change, which is an organisation that does all sorts of work in the social justice space and adding value sort of socially, we were supported to start running a series of Hopes for Ed, as we called them. And we called them that because they called them that. And about 2 years ago, Hopes for Ed worked on and developed and published, Big Change worked on and developed and published what they called their Hopes for Education, which was a manifesto of 10 sort of really big topics that we might like to see happen in our education system and change and transformation happen in our education system over the next decade. And we explored those on a Wednesday night in the dark depths of winter and emerging out of winter into spring. We explored those 10 Hopes for Eds, one per session. We can't cover them all in what is a 45-minute session at our summer fete, but we're going to reprise and revisit some of them. And I would encourage you, to have a look at those Hopes for Ed and see which ones of those resonate for you. And they're available on our website, and they're obviously available on the Big Change website. But as in terms of being able to contribute to that, I would encourage you to come and sort of join our conversations at Heads Up for Head Teachers. But I would also encourage you to get involved with the big education conversation, which you can find on social media, which is another opportunity to really get involved in a conversation about what education is, what education could be, and what education should be. So that's the sort of intro and framing for this session. We're really delighted to be joined by our wonderful panelists this morning, who all contributed in brilliant ways to our Hopes for Ed discussions. You are all very, very welcome. And we've got about 40 minutes to have a sort of discussion and a chat about some of the things that we spoke about in those sessions. And a really big, unsurprisingly, given everything we said in the first 2 sessions, but a really big theme of the Hopes for Ed is, education which is for young people and is co-constructed with them and developed with them, and with their voice being a really powerful and important part of what we do in education. And we had a really empowering and thought-provoking session which involved pupil power, and I'm absolutely delighted that Lottie, you can join us from Pupil Power this morning. And so Lottie, I'm going to come to you first, and perhaps you might want to talk about the work that Pupil Power does, and from the sort of pupil power perspective, what change you would like to see in education, and what's great and should be celebrated, but what also could change and be different into the future. So Lottie, over to you first.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me as well. Can you hear me okay? Yes, okay, good. So I just want to say thanks for having me, of course, and I'll introduce myself. So I'm Lottie. I'm a part of the Pupil Power, which is a really cool movement made up of young people aged 11 to probably early 20s. I'm not sure who the oldest is. And we aim to make changes in education that students want to see throughout the country. So we really want to represent their voices as a body of really, really diverse students, which I think is really, really important. And when what you said there about what you want to change in education, I put this message out to our members a couple of nights ago, and we had a long conversation about it. So I have a few points I'd like to share. So I'm just going to find where I've written them, which are really, really cool. And we've got, again, because of such a diverse group, the responses we got were so varied and so wonderful. So I'll quickly go over them now. So a lot of our members were focused on assessment style and how that could change. And I'll read one thing someone says was assessments in the way we have them now are extremely ableist and put disabled students at a major advantage. And this is something we are totally willing to change. And we have been supporting different kind of bodies when we were campaigning to have exams cancelled and vice versa. We don't know what the solution is to that, if I'm honest. But as a collective, we are working to find one. We have, again, being so varied, we have an array of opinions there. But again, we will find it and we're working towards that. Another one is student voice needs to go beyond the school council. And we spoke a lot about this in the session that People Power did a while ago. School councils are predominantly white, they're predominantly female, and they're predominantly made up of students who are the good ones and are going to say the right things or whatever. But do they create change? And do they create an honest perspective of what students think and feel about school? Probably not, in my opinion. It would be good to get some quantifiable research on this, but just from our experiences as a collective, we said no here. And a lot of people feel completely disenfranchised from school councils as well. So People Power is being the student voice that goes beyond school council. But for a lot of school leaders and school teachers, it's quite uncomfortable to have a group of young people very blatantly say this isn't working. So events like this is so wonderful because we have teachers who are listening and then can convince others who may be a bit more skeptical at the moment. So another thing is ensuring there is respect of students being real people and allowing them basic autonomy. Excuse me, I completely stuttered there. But again, another thing we discussed was allowing students to kind of do their, basic human rights in school. For example, being able to go to the toilet when they ask to, or being able to go for a walk if they're getting a little bit stressed and flustered going to get a drink. That is something that, again, is policed in school and is a big problem, because if you're being able to police when someone naturally needs to go to the toilet, what else can you police? Where does that go? And students aren't learning, consent and how to say no and how to say yes to things, because this is a rule, you must stick to it. Again, this is something we completely want to change, and we're developing a Know Your Rights card, which will be given out to students, where when these situations are difficult, they are able to say, actually, no, I can stand up for myself and say, I need to go and do this, so I will. And that is basically everything that we discussed in a very, very short time frame. So yeah, that is me. And if you want to support People Power, just please check us out on Instagram and Twitter. We're just under @ThePeoplePower.
Brilliant, thank you, Lottie. And I think one of the things that was really powerful in the session, there's a couple of, as you said, like actually the head teachers that were in the room that night when we ran that session, there was no dissent. There was no, well, we don't agree with that. And I think at the heart of what you're doing is what we know at a human level is the right thing to do, but we sometimes feel restricted by the system in which we operate and stops us from doing it. But I think the overarching thing for me, and this is very much at the heart of the big education conversation, and is at the heart of what you're saying around student council, is actually, education isn't, it's transactional to a degree, but it's not, it shouldn't be transactional. It should be a co-constructed collaborative. We talk about our schools as communities all of the time, and communities of young people and of staff and of parents and of local businesses. And of course, somebody needs to take the lead in that. The professionals need to take the lead in that, having the professional understanding of education and learning and what learning is. But I think ultimately we definitely need to listen to and be better at listening to all of the different stakeholders and the contribution that they can make, not just to voicing what they think should happen, but also getting involved in action, which will change it as well. So we end up with communities that are properly co-constructed by all of the people that are in it. And the work that you do at Pupil Power is really powerful in leading that. So I'm hoping that we've got a longer term relationship with you, and you will come back and contribute to further hopes for Ed Sessions next academic year. And moving on from that is very much one of our other sort of really powerful sessions was around the need, picking up on that, is around the need for professional learning. And we talked earlier on about sometimes there's a danger in schools that we sort of positionally put some groups ahead of others. So we talk about, head teachers will talk about, always put children first. And one of the things we challenge at Heads Up for Head Teachers is that actually it doesn't need to be like that. Actually, we are a community, and surely we all put each other first, and we're all as important to each other. And one of the things that they explore as part of the host read and we explored was this notion that professional learning is as important as student learning, and that we keep professional learning very much at the fore of what we do, and we invest in it properly, both as a system but also at an individual school level. And we were really privileged to be joined in that session by the wonderful Sam Twiselton and the wonderful Karen Edge, who have now, I think, because they've done so many events together, have started to refer to themselves as Twistle Edge, I think, as a sort of joint combo. So Sam and Karen, and Karen first, I'm going to come to you about, sort of how we can work as head teachers to develop really sort of supportive school cultures that prioritize teachers and teacher learning as much as they prioritize young people and young people's learning, recognizing that one is hugely beneficial to the other, and it's a very much a symbiotic relationship that's powerful. So Karen, over to you first, and then Sam will continue next.
And I'm very conscious of the fact that this yellow dot on this side here, I got a message saying, can you move your camera? So I'm away for a couple of days with my 10-year-old, and the only spot where you can actually take in that view. And I'm literally balancing on the edge of a stool. So now I'm really uncomfortable. So just so you know, on behalf of not having the dot in the middle of my face. So in true Twiselton fashion, I think there were a few things that I wanted to say that were probably a bit more macro about creating cultures in school, and then Sam was actually going to have a conversation a bit about the work that she's been doing in terms of, teacher learning at all stages of the career. And there's a few things that I wanted to say about what's actually getting in the way of us being able to create those cultures, both within the school and within the country in general. So my accent is Canadian. I'm also British, just before anyone calls me American. But I think for me, it's that we have so much hierarchy in place in England, and we can't escape it at any time. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we struggle a bit more than other places might in terms of developing cultures that feel whole. So whether it's based on, your accent, how much money you have, where you went to university, what color you are, what gender you are, it's complicated, and it's more complicated here, and you can feel it if you haven't grown up here. So I think that's one of the things that gets in the way. And then at the moment, there's a certain wave of pessimism that we're experiencing. So we've got Brexit, we've got COVID, we've got, we got a ping through this morning from my son's head teacher that, one of the classes, the second one this week, has gone out with a positive case. And it's the weekend, and the schools are carrying all the heavy lifting for contact tracing. So I think we talk about head teacher well-being, but we're not nationally recognizing the fact that the people who are doing most of our contact tracing are actually head teachers who have another job. So for me, I think the question sort of goes back to what the session before was talking about, which is, why do we ask the questions about what would make this a great place to work? And do we listen? Right? So the first question is do we say, like, do you love your work? What would make you love your work? Do you feel loved actually in the building? And I think teachers think about this in the context of their students. They want everyone to be engaged and involved, but we forget about that individualized teacher support that we can have as we go on, and the fact that my experiences will be very, very different than Sam's. And what we need to feel engaged will be radically different, but it won't cost a lot of money. And often it's literally just being able to have a relationship with someone who understands you. So we see a lot in our research about teachers wanting to feel cared for, and care looks like having someone who knows you, understanding that you have a life outside of school, and that life doesn't just revolve around children. That you can have a life if you're single, you can have a life if you're in a partnership, you can have a life if you are caring for your parents. And I think that is, that's something to really consider. So the questions I have are we asking, is this school a good place to work? And does it bring you joy to come to work? And are there things that we could get rid of that actually don't make it a good place to work? So often there's like 3 or 4 little things that instantly you could say, okay, you know what, we're not doing that anymore. And I don't think we're willing to take the risk to both ask the question, but also to hear what the answers are. So my plea I think there's two things that are both about creating school cultures that work, but what James and Kate are doing in terms of a bigger system-wide conversation. So my biggest fear, and this happens when you've got lots of different schools that are responsible for themselves, is that there are splinter groups, advocacy splinter groups. So in a lot of other jurisdictions, you will have one organization that speaks for the head teachers. Here, we are incredibly fortunate to have diverse ed, women's ed, Hope's Heads Up for Head Teachers. We have so many now different organizations that are advocating and similarly advocating for the same thing, for fairness, for consistency, for love, for respect. And because we're all advocating differently, does that actually mean that the messages that we're trying to create and share are actually not being heard as loudly as they could be? So one of the things that I would sort of plea for is that, as Pupil Power is arguing, I have a 10-year-old in the room, you can probably hear the biting of crisps. So in Canada, we have ketchup chips, and in England, we've just got ketchup tomato sauce chips. So because we're watching England tonight on this very large screen, we have lots of ketchup chips. That was the request. So he came in, snuck around in there, and he thinks I can't hear you eating the crisps. So apologies for that. But in terms of what Isaac knows what he wants a school to be, he can tell you. Right? He will tell you what it feels to be loved at school. And it feels that everyone is, when they put their hands up, they're called on equally. That, recently we've had a discussion about the kids who are still doing really well are the ones whose parents worked tirelessly with them during lockdown. That can't happen for all parents, including this one. And it is not fair that he will be judged because I wasn't doing his homework. So consistency, fairness, respect. Can we advocate together for the change that we want? And then I think you need more nerds involved. So speaking as a nerd with my fellow, Twiselton member, who's also a nerd, I think, and it's quite funny, I did say to both Kate and James this week, you need a nerd on your advisory council. We need to ask the questions, but not just ask them and talk about them and vent in the most positive of ways, but we need to vent and capture and analyze together as a big group, and then be able to put it back and say, we have evidence that this is what it's like at the moment, and advocate for different people who can then make it change. My phone usually never rings, so it's all going on today. So I'm just going to pass on to Sam, but I think so. It's the plea for ask the questions, find out what makes people happy, and then try and advocate collectively across all of us, and make sure that the nerds are involved, because the evidence that you've gathered is so powerful. But sometimes you just need a nerd buddy to make sure that you've gathered it in a way that isn't just people chatting, which is important, but it's evidence that you can use to articulate for better policy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Karen. As ever, just really sort of powerful inputs. I was sort of drawing out and connecting to some of the first couple of sessions, but I think that point about, you made the point about staff and really talking staff and listening staff in the same way that we, Lottie has called for us to really talk to and listen to our young people. I think that's so important. And Sam, this is sort of leading to you really, but I look back on a career of CPDL, both for myself, but also planning it for others. And that sort of very transactional projected CPDL, so this is what the school needs, so this is what you're going to work on in the next 12 months. And Karen, picking up on your point about what, where do we really get into a space where we understand the narrative of our staff and where they've come from and what they need, and so that they can really sort of become, they can have their own purpose of individuality within the greater purpose of the school, and they can have real agency then on how they need to develop. I think is so important. I also wonder, and maybe put this challenge out there to the people that are listening or the people that watch later on. Hi, Isaac. I wonder whether we need to, as well as asking staff, is this a good place to work? Whether as head teachers we should ask ourselves that question. Because I think sometimes perhaps in the deep, dark depths of our brain and our hearts, we know that it's not, and we continue to do it because we think it's what the system wants us to do, but it is contradictory to our own purpose and what we want to achieve. And actually, maybe a simple question for everybody to do later on, as they're watching the England game, or after they've watched the England game and they've had a glass of wine or glass of lemonade or a cup of tea or whatever it might be, is go, actually, is my school a good place to work for me? Actually, so I would put that one out there. But Karen, thank you for that. And Sam, over to you to sort of pick up on that thread about how we really create sort of networks of CPD, and it's purposeful, and it's got agency for staff in it, and the work that you're doing in the system. And apologies if you can hear my 6-year-old screaming in the background. He appears to be having a bit of a paddy at the moment, but I can't do anything about that, so he'll just have to get on with it.
Yeah,
over to you, Sam.
Isn't it? First of all, I think, although I quite like Twizzle Edge, I think Edgy Twizzle is better, because I think Karen should always go first anyway, as she just has. But also, she has that edginess in such a lovely, constructive way. You know, that was a brilliant question, wasn't it, that she asked us all there? And that's what she does. She just always asks the questions that really make you think. So, I mean, kind of following on from what she said, but also I really enjoyed listening into the conversation in the previous session, and the importance of, you know, reconnecting to the why and how important that is. And actually, every time I've joined up with you guys, that's always been a really central part of the discussion, one way or the other. I think it's got to be a central part of how we think about staff development, and how we think about how we support the staff in our school. And last time I was with you, I remember there was a big discussion then about how people had actually quite enjoyed, you know, one of the sort of spin-offs of COVID, and, you know, what a terrible time we've all been living through, was the fact it had helped people to strip things right back, and literally initially stripping right back to making sure kids are fed. Are they safe? Are they secure? And you know, and that sense of moral purpose was really so visibly and obviously driving everybody who works in education, but particularly school leaders. There was a lot of discussion at the time, and I think it's continued, about the importance of really, really holding on to that sense of moral purpose. And I think that's really so important when we think about our staff as well, whoever we are, teachers, teaching assistants, anybody working in a school to support learning. They need to be able to connect to that sense of moral purpose. But as school leaders, you need to see your responsibility to yourself, but also your responsibility to your staff in the same way as we saw that massive sense of responsibility to children. So I think schools have always been really, really good at wrapping themselves around the needs of their children. That's usually what everybody who's there gets up out of bed in the morning to do. But I think there's something about recognizing that you can't do that if you're not also attending to the needs of your staff. So there's something about schools also wrapping themselves around the needs of their staff, at all staff, every level, including the leaders. It's that oxygen mask thing, isn't it? You can't look after the children if you haven't looked after yourself first. And kind of following on a bit from some of the earlier discussion, looking after your staff just involves keeping them developed and involves keeping them supported. And the most important thing that you can do there is have a healthy culture within the school, within the group of schools, if you're lucky enough to work in that way, that nurtures the importance of staff development and supporting staff, but in a way that does connect to that why, that sense of purpose. So you were talking, James, about, you know, I think we've all been guilty of engaging in and sometimes leading staff development, which is just purely transactional. And, you know, and the transactional bit needs to be that, yeah, we know we need to know how to do that phonics better, or to administer that particular form of assessment. So the transactional has to be there. But if it doesn't connect to that sense of moral purpose, if it doesn't have that bigger picture element to it, then you're not nurturing your staff. You're probably penalising your staff one way or another. And so I think one of the really hard things, but also exciting things about really good staff development is, how do you get that balance between reconnecting to the why and the bigger picture? But then the really hard bit, but the fascinating bit, especially for nerds like Karen and myself, is how do you translate that bigger picture into this decision I'm making in this moment about the right thing to say or the right thing to do, whether it's to a staff meeting, whether it's to a child who's trying to get their head around a particular concept, whatever it is. How does my sense of moral purpose and what gets me out of bed in the morning, how does that translate into me making the right decision in order to get the best out of this particular moment that's in front of me? And I think really good staff development sort of iterates between those two things, that bigger picture and then a sort of micro moment of what am I doing here and now. And the what am I doing here and now, I think, is something that when school leaders are thinking about what their staff needs, what they need to be aware of, that's going to vary enormously, again, building on what Karen was saying just now. You know, so a brand new teacher starting in a school in September is not going to be able to think about anything else other than how do I get these children to listen to me? How do I get them organised? How do I get them to line up? What are the rules around social distancing? There's going to be loads of really practical things that are just going to completely dominate their every sort of thinking moment. And if we don't attend to those needs for those staff and really give them the advice that they need at that point, that this is how you do it, this is how you line up, and actually don't worry, you're stressed about it now, but you know, in a month's time, most of this will have become so automatic you don't even have to think about it anymore. But recognizing that they can't think about anything else until they've got over that hump, and that is what they need from you right now. But then also not getting into the trap of only ever talking about how you get the children to line up, and making sure that you do have that reconnection back to the bigger picture. The whole point of why these children need to line up is that they can get learning quickly, and we want them to be learning because we know that can transform their understanding and transform their lives. It's kind of making sure you're having enough of those kind of discussions as well, I think, really. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that staff will have different needs at different times. And we need to recognise that and be alert to it. And there's quite a lot of research that can help us to kind of suggest what will be the most impactful for those different sets of needs. But I think regardless of who you are, what level you're at, what role you're in, your practical needs are always going to need to reconnect back to that why we're all here, and that sense of moral purpose. And I think one of the reasons why in recent years we've had problems with staff retention is when there feels like there's a really disconnect there. So all these practical things I'm spending all my time doing, you know, data entry, triple marking, whatever it is, actually is going against that bigger picture sense of moral purpose. I feel like it's stopping me doing the reason why I came into the profession rather than helping me. So again, that helps, I think, with that really hard question is what is it we can stop doing that's actually making this not a good place to work rather than a good place to work. And it will usually one way or another connect back to that bigger picture. I think I'm just about done. I think, yeah, I suppose just to summarize really, regardless of who you are, what level you're at, what role you're in, you need individually and collectively to feel like you're part of a culture that is connecting you as an individual to that sense of moral purpose, to that culture of support and development, and to a regular kind of reconnection to the bigger picture of education and why we're all here. That's me done.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. Yeah, I just, wow, so much of that connects to the previous two sessions, but the sort of the work that we've been doing more broadly across the Heads Up for Head Teachers network. I suppose the thing that I'm reflecting on is, and I'm sort of interested in the terminology that becomes embedded in our system. So actually CPD and CPDL, and actually I'm now questioning, is it generally CPD or is it CPI? And so what I mean by that, is it a reflection of the deficit model in which the culture of deficit in which we exist in England is that, it's a constant projection that things in education are broken and they need to be fixed. And we talked earlier on about the fact that actually that's challengeable hugely, actually, because 80 to 90% of what we do on a daily basis is really, really good. And yet we spend all of our time in this 10 to 20% space of stuff that needs to improve. And so actually, in doing that, do we then fall into the trap of offering people career professional improvement rather than the career professional development? And I just wonder whether there is a need to explore, okay, what does development actually mean? And who owns it and where does it sit? And then, as you say, you can then start to explore the big picture and the connection to the purpose of our school and what we're all about and what our community is all about, for young people and for staff and for parents. But you can also, you can have that connection, but you can also enable people to take agency then over what they're doing and what they need to develop, rather than putting people in this position of, I need to do this because the school doesn't think I'm very good, which I think is often the underpinning for a lot of not very good CPDL. Is implicitly it's about, well, we saw that lesson and we didn't think you did a very good job of questioning, so therefore you need to improve your questioning, which isn't, we wouldn't do that with young people necessarily. So that always fascinates me why we do that with staff. But in that reflection, I'm reflecting on the work I used to lead as a head teacher. So I think it's a good one for everybody to reflect on, is that notion of, what is it career professional development, and where is the agency, and where is the ownership, and where is the connection. And then sort of that brings us really nicely back. We started with Lottie and pupil power, and then we really sort of focused in on, as the Hopes for Ed do, what are we doing with our staff then to really make that happen. But sort of leads us really nicely to Adrian, and your work, Adrian, and your perspective, both as a member of the advisory board, a member of Heads Up for Head Teachers, but also a member of a MAT in the Midlands, about the work that you do in that MAT, but the work that you also do personally about the exam accountability, and how that keeps us really focused on actually what is a very narrow part of what we do. And your desire for a much more student-focused approach. So it sort of brings us full circle back to the purpose, being led by what we're doing on behalf of our students. So over to you, Adrian, to talk about that a little bit, and what your hopes for education are in that sphere.
Thanks, James.
And Adrian, can I just say, it's a very, is that a moody background you've got there, Adrian, or is that actually the weather behind you?
That is actually the weather. I'm because of circumstance, I'm sat in my car doing this, so you can see through my sunroof what the weather's like outside. It's not great today.
You can see the birds going by. It's brilliant.
So to start with, I just want to say it's an absolute pleasure to have sat and listened to the three other panelists this morning, or now this afternoon, and they've give the real zoomed in version of what I'm going to talk about as more of a wider approach. So I'm going to talk about two strands, and Sam really just hit the nail on the head for me. It is about that moral purpose, and the moral purpose of are two fronts of being student focused and staff and leader focused. So going back to Lottie's point about being student focused, the children that we serve will tell us everything that we need to know. And the trauma, because there is no other word for it, the trauma that they've been through over the last 18 months is really imperative that we listen to that and that we respond in an appropriate way, because that trauma will be completely different across our school context, across a multi-academy trust context. So as an example, we've got 8 schools in our multi-academy trust, and no one school has got the same issue as another school. They're all very different and all very complex, and we're all very closely geographically located. So to really sum up there, that is about listening to your school community, listening to the children, listening to what they know that they need, even though that they're the children. We have to listen to them, because that is the future. That's the power of moving things forwards. Moving away from that a little bit, I'm hopeful as we go forwards with the conversations that are going on, and big education are leading some around reshaping and rethinking assessment. When we think about it, there has been no assessment for any of our children over the last 2 years. And when we break it down to the most simplistic factor, has the world ended? Has everything stopped? Are we in the middle of like the most biggest horror show ever because of that? There's been no SATs. Have those children, really become disadvantaged because of that? No, they haven't. Okay. So one of the things that I hear quite clearly being put out, and my own MP wrote back to me when I challenged them about it, and said that we have to have SATs because we want to test the schools are doing everything that they should be. That's a nonsense as to why we're putting those children through that, and that needs to change. So I'm hopeful that we haven't had 2 years of SATs, that we can do something that builds for a better future. We've had 2 years where our year 11 and year 13 students haven't had those examinations, and those examinations, put so much stress and pressure on everything that up until that point. My question is there a better way? And we all know that there's a better way, because what employers are telling us, what universities are telling us, that there's a disconnect between the real world and education at the moment. Employers are telling us that the assessment system isn't fit for purpose. They're looking for young people who have a wide variety of experiences, have a wide variety of character traits, have experience in doing different things other than just, for want of a better phrase, an academic background. They want to know, how are they going to respond under pressure? Have they got the ability to think outside of the box? They were looking for innovation. And sadly, the system that we have at the moment isn't providing that. Eleanor Wilson wrote a brilliant article this week for SecEd about rethinking assessment and the possibility of creating a 4-year baccalaureate style approach, combining academic, technical, and vocational qualification pathways. That would give our children and our young people a voice to be able to say, this is where I'm interested, this is what I want to do. Because what we have at the moment is very narrow focused, when all of our children are judged by the EBAC, for example, because schools are judged by it. That's wrong. And going back to that moral point and that moral purpose, how can we, be, how is it that every year a third of our children cannot get the pass grade from an examination? That's not morally correct. We're talking about all the time that we want to improve standards, we want to improve the situation for our young people, but yet the system dictates that a third of them cannot do that. That's wrong, and we need to look at a different way of doing that. I'll stop there because I could go on for an hour about all of this. In terms of from a staff and leader focus point of view, they're our bread and butter. They're the most important resource that we have in schools, and we need to make sure that we look after them. And all the things that Karen and Sam have already said, we can't do it without them. We have to tap into the innovation and the creativity that's in them. At the moment, we don't always do that because of the rigidity of the system. We all know that there's a recruitment shortage for teachers, but more worryingly, we have a retention crisis of teachers. And we've got to do something about that to ensure that we don't, we're not spread even thinner. One of the things that really concerns me is that we keep hearing that there's a shortage of head teachers. And why wouldn't it be? Because what's the message and the narrative that's given out there at the moment? You've heard from Karen, you've heard from Sam about the importance of making sure that we look after them. And I'm glad to say that I'm part of an organisation that does that. And there are many others out there that are doing that. But we need to do more than that, because what's happening is that filters downhill. And that filters down to our deputy head teachers and our assistant head teachers and our middle leaders who look up and they say, well, actually, why would I want to be part of that? Why would I want to subject myself to that? So we need to support those guys, and we need to create a support network for them to ensure that they understand that what's being portrayed at the minute isn't the only way. It's not the be all and end all. And if, in the state sector, if the 22,000 head teachers says, no, we're not operating in that way, what would happen? We would have a massive sea of change. I know I'm oversimplifying that, but what we need to do is we need to make sure that we've got a level of support in place now for our head teachers to reassure them and to allow them to be the head teachers and the leaders that they set out to be. What we need to do now is set that up for our assistant head teachers and our deputy head teachers. And I'm proud and privileged to say that at HeadsUp4HTs, that's what we're going to be starting in September. And we want to allow those deputy head teachers and assistant head teachers that space to be able to go and learn from other people that are in their space to say, actually, what I may be experiencing, that isn't the only way. I can go and I can voice in a safe space what's happening and getting support for that and getting some guidance in how they can be the leader that they set out to be. So I'm really excited to be part of that as we move forward in a new academic year. And I'll stop there because I can see that we're coming close to the end of time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Adrian. And yeah, really great that we can announce that this afternoon. that we're gonna extend out. We've always had assistant heads and deputy heads as part of our network of Heads Up for Head Teachers. We describe ourselves as a network for head teachers past, present, and future. But that specifically we will have that network, that safe space, and that place for debate for assistant heads and deputy heads as well is really exciting development for September. I think I'll come back to if we sort of come back to hopes for Ed, and we've had the sort of the hopes for education from a young person's perspective, and we've had hopes for Ed in regards to how we develop and how we really bring our staff on, and your point, Adrian, about perhaps some of the things that drive us to behave in the way that we do, and you've touched on assessment and the work of Big Education and the Rethinking Assessment Group, which is really powerful stuff, and lots of others in the network are also sort of actually how do we take this opportunity to rethink assessment? You say we really missed it. Have we finally reached a point where we acknowledge that the piece of paper that children clutch when they're 16 with 9 grades on it or 10 grades on it does not define them. It's just a tiny bit of who they are. But in that is a recognition in the last 18 months that we didn't have those assessments, but that didn't mean that learning didn't happen, because it does feel as if our only way of judging whether learning has happened is through collectively collecting all of that data together, and as you say, using it to judge schools. And that's the other problem with assessment, is the way in which what is a system which is supposed to be something for the children has become something to judge schools, and in that it's driven this sort of accountability system which takes us away from our purpose. And looping back to Sam, it inevitably takes us away from our purpose and what we do. So huge things that we could debate probably all afternoon and into the night, and we probably get so wrapped up in it that we wouldn't even think about the football, maybe. So we might miss the football this afternoon because we'd be discussing them. But I suppose the point of Heads Up for Head Teachers connecting with big change and the hopes for Ed is the point, Adrian, that you made, and then Karen, picking up on the one that you made about sort of splintering and splinter groups, is we are so much more powerful when we talk about these things together and we connect together and we have a united voice on these things. So one of the ways in which I think we can all do that is through Big Changes, Big Education conversation. Do get involved in that. That's open to professionals, it's open to parents, it's open to pupils. But I do think, there is in running a network and the network of Heads Up for Head Teachers, and the emerging one of Heads Up for Deputy Head Teachers and Assistant Head Teachers as well, is that need for us to connect women ed and diverse ed and Heads Up for Head Teachers and all of those other groups together, and pupil power, and actually create round tables of discussion around those things is one of the things that I think we could do. Because I agree, Adrian, if 24,000 head teachers across this land, together with the pupils, together with the professional bodies, and together with the other representatives of other networks of people, if we all stood and said the same thing, and this brings us right back to the heart of this, the heart and the start of Heads Up for Head Teachers, is this notion that we operate in education here, technically, and with our knowledge of education, but a big part of the equation is what comes from here and our hearts, and we're having to stop this one because the focus is all on what's happening up here. And actually, collectively, if we said, no, education is much more complex than that, and we have to stop dehumanizing it and recognize it as a complex human system, we will end up with something which is much more connected and connected to purpose, but also has a real moral core to it, that we're doing the right thing by our young people and the right thing by our staff and the right thing by ourselves as leaders. So hopes for Ed, big conversations. We've had a taster of them this afternoon, and thank you to everybody who has contributed to that. So Lottie and Karen and Sam and Adrian. Lots of opportunity next year. So alongside the support sessions that we run, Heads Up for Head Teachers, alongside the one-to-one support that we offer, alongside the buddying system that we offer, we also run these sessions on a every fortnight basis, where we can just talk about what are our hopes for education, what would we like to see happen, and they're always informed and provoked by brilliant voices, a sample of which we've had this afternoon. And I'm going to wave at Isaac now. Hi, Isaac. How you doing? He's good. He's looking forward to the football, I can tell. So thank you for joining us for this session. It's awesome to see the people in the room, but hopefully it's been really useful for those of you listening. We've got another quick 15-minute break. They absolutely fly by, and then it will be 1 o'clock, and we'll be going to our last session, which I can't believe already, our last session of this year's Summer Fete, and we'll be talking about what it means to really get under the skin of well-being and looking after each other and ourselves in a bit more detail. So exploring that. So thanks once again to Lottie, Karen, Sam and Adrian, and the wonderful, as ever, Kate Smith, who pulled all of this together and made this happen. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you everybody very much.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Bye.